we see one of the most iconic conversations in all of history, certainly in biblical history, happen in this week's Torah portion, Vayera. Here is the scene. Abraham is sitting outside his tent, recovering from surgery on a very sensitive place on his body, especially for a 90-year-old man. And three men approach his tent, and he's never seen them before. And, they could be thieves, they could be robbers, they could be dangerous. But he does not approach them that way. He says, Sarah, go make lunch. He invites them in. We have guests. Wash your feet. Please don't go on. Stay here. Let us take care of you. He is exceedingly hospitable. And it turns out, so these guests come in and they say to him, next year we're going to come back here and you, my friend, are going to have a son. You and your wife, who are in your 90s, your postmenopausal wife, will give birth to a biological son, which is obviously something Abraham and Sarah had given up on long ago, thinking impossible at their age. They can't believe it. Their guests eat, they leave, and Abraham walks them out and sees them off in the direction of Sodom. And after these three mysterious guests leave Abraham and Sarah's tent, headed toward Sodom, God muses to God's self. Should I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? I have singled him out, after all, that the nations of the world should bless themselves by him and his descendants by doing what is just and right. The words are tzedakah umishpat. God says, God sort of says to God's self. So God then says to Abraham, the outrage of Sodom and Gomorrah is so great, their sin so grave, I will go down there to see if they have acted according to the outcry that has reached me. And you know what happens next, because Jews love this story. Abraham negotiates with God. We love this story because it exemplifies a value we hold dear, which is that no one, not even God, is above the law. So Abraham, talking to the creator of the universe, he doesn't bring bravado, although honestly the humility he brings feels a little forced. He says, oh God, don't mind me. I'm a little nobody. I'm just dust and ashes. However, I do have to ask, would the God of justice not act justly? Hashofet kol haaretz lo ya'aseh mishpat. Might I venture to put forth that if there are 40 people, innocent people in the town of Sodom and Gomorrah, might you spare them? And God says, for 40 people, I'll spare the towns. And then Abraham, coming forward, dust and ashes though I am, might I suggest that it's possible the 40 might lack 5? Will you spare the towns then? Yes, God says I will. What about 20? Would you spare the towns for 20? God says for 20 innocent people, I will spare the towns. And Abraham goes a step further then, now he's on a roll. What about 10? And God says, yes, for 10 innocent people among the entire city, I would spare the cities. The conversation ends at that point, and Abraham and God part ways. But this is one of the places where we get the model of Abraham, both, the person who is the most hospitable in the Torah, opening up his tent to strangers, and also the upstander, the advocate for justice. The only thing is, Sodom and Gomorrah get destroyed, which begs the question, what was this sin, this grave sin or culture of sin that was so pervasive that it affected everyone? There was not an innocent person to be found. Sin so corrosive, so kaved, heavy, inextricable, so unavoidable for everyone in the town that the consequence had to be destroying it. So I want to pivot now away from Abraham to the people of Sodom. There are a few ways to learn Torah. Sometimes I say the Torah can be descriptive, meaning we learn from what the Torah says to do. Or rather, let me try that again. The Torah can be prescriptive, meaning the Torah tells us to do things, so we do it. But sometimes the Torah is descriptive, meaning characters could be acting well or not acting well. What they are doing is reflecting reality. that sometimes what we learn from Torah is simply descriptive reality. It's mirroring us to us, and that's how we learn. And sometimes we learn from seeing the heroic, courageous acts of exemplars in the Torah, and sometimes we learn to avoid the mistakes of characters in the Torah. This week we get both. And when it comes to Sodom and Gomorrah, it might be easy to think these people, these Sodomites, must just have been the most craven, evil, awful, bloodthirsty, terrible people in the world to deserve the fate they got, especially recognizing God said, I will not destroy these cities if there are 10 innocent people, and yet the cities were destroyed. But what if the Sodomites are not craven and evil of a genre we could not imagine, but rather, what if they're not that different from us? What if we need to hear this story to avoid their fate, not because we're so different from the Sodomites, but to avoid becoming them, or to see the ways in which we already have become them? So I've mostly given away my thesis here, but now I want to paint a picture, which the truth is the tradition makes really fun in a sort of twisted, macabre way, by describing the things the Sodomites did to earn this consequence. And most of this is not in the Torah, actually. The Torah gives us some hints, especially in Genesis chapter 19. But the rabbis of the Talmud and the Midrash, this is about 1,500 years ago to 2,000 years ago, kind of go wild, giving us a lot of really juicy, gory detail about these sins that led to this outcry. So let's just look at a few. Here's one. The soil of Sodom and Gomorrah was so rich and fertile that when a farmer would rinse off greens grown in the field, gold dust would shake out. And so the townspeople said, looking around, we live in a town with abundance of food and water, precious stones, pearls, gold. Any visitor, any guest or immigrant coming through here is only coming to strip us of our wealth. Come, let us make sure that our duty toward travelers, toward the stranger, is utterly forgotten. And so God, hearing this, thought, if you want to utterly forget the vulnerable, I will make it so that you are utterly forgotten. That's one encapsulation of the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah. Not just selfishness, but a specific kind of selfishness. Not just not sharing abundance with strangers. Not just not sharing your abundance, but not sharing your abundance with strangers and the most vulnerable. Having so much and not seeing the abundance that you have is made holy, made meaningful through sharing it. And not just with your family, but specifically the people who can't access that wealth themselves, can't speak the language, or don't have a home, or are otherwise considered strangers or outsiders. What a contrast to Abraham, with whom we began our story today, literally opening his tent and his table to strangers. The rabbis in the Mishnah, in Pirkei Avot, describe 4 different character traits of a human being. One kind of human being says, what's mine is mine, and what's yours is mine. Of that person, they say, that's a wicked person. The one that says, what's mine is yours, and what's yours is also yours. That person is a pious, righteous person. The one that says, what's mine is yours, and what's yours is mine, is an idiot, is an am haaretz. That person doesn't know how the world works. They don't know what they're talking about. The one who says, what's mine is mine, and what's yours is yours, is a morally mediocre person. And some would say, midat Sodom, a sodomite, a Sodom-type person. Really? What's mine is mine, and what's yours is yours. It seems perfectly American, right? It's like the law of individualism. And so it's worth noting, midat Sodom is not the wicked one. Midat Sodom is just the one that's indifferent to someone else's circumstances or needs or vulnerability. I do me, you do you. Your business, not my problem. My business, not your problem. And this, they say, is what leads to the downfall of society. Tomorrow, when we gather in person, I'm going to ask the crowd, how does this lead to the downfall of society? I expect people to have, more interesting answers than, some of the ones I'll hazard here, but let's just think about it for a second. What's mine is mine and what's yours is yours. That is Midat Sodom. That leads to the dissolution, the desecration, the destruction of society. Because that's what happened to Sodom and Gomorrah. Be curious to hear, for those of you who are in the chat, feel free to answer that question. How does that Midat Sodom mindset, what's mine is mine, what's yours is yours, lead to the downfall of society? Well, let's imagine a guy who's like making toxic waste. It's his toxic waste, but he lives on a beachfront, so it's also his beachfront. He dumps his toxic waste off of his beachfront, but it's into water that's shared by everybody. Everybody drinks the water. Now everybody gets sick and might even die. And think like Flint, Michigan, individuals who shirked personal responsibility that ended up creating collective suffering. Pandemics, epidemics, when people don't have health care, and yet, for a variety of reasons, they don't have jobs, they aren't citizens, they can't get public insurance, they can't afford it, and there's an outbreak of an epidemic, purely hypothetically, if only some people in the population get vaccinated and others do not, the epidemic will rage on, right? If people just worry about themselves and not about the whole, then everyone will continue to be at risk. We are all in this boat together, right? The rabbis of the Talmud tell an actual story about a boat where there's a guy drilling a hole under his seat. The guy behind him says, "Hey, what are you doing?" The guy in front of him says, "What do you care? It's my seat. I'm just drilling under my seat." The guy behind him says, "Yeah, but when water comes in through your hole under your seat, we all go down." And Rabbi Stephen pointed out to me, what we're talking about here is when there's somebody who's like actively doing something that's destructive to society, even if they're just doing it in their own home. But what about just how we kind of collectively abdicate responsibility? Think of the number of unhoused people in Chicago who will die on our streets this winter. It's not really cold yet, but it happens every year. And it happens every year against the backdrop of how many hundreds or thousands of beds in homes and unused rooms and even coach houses, hotel rooms, and floors of buildings that are open. But not to strangers, not to outsiders, not to people not like us. This is Midat Sodom. Here's another Sodom story from the Midrash. When a poor traveler came through, the people of Sodom would give him $1 with their own name written on it. When the traveler would use the money to buy bread, nobody would sell it to him because he was an outsider. Eventually, when the person died of hunger, each Sodomite would go and reclaim his $1. Funny joke to play on outsiders, right? Haha. No, obviously it's not funny at all. In Sodom, cruelty was a sport. Barbarism. Because they could. Because it was funny. There was a kind of social agreement that enabled bullying and meanness. It was normal. It was the law. The sin that you might think of when you think of Sodom has to do with sex, right? But that's only an issue because, and this is what you read in Genesis 19, only an issue because the townspeople forced guests coming into their city into it violently, coercively, in a gang mob situation. That's the sin of Sodom. When cruelty and violence and bullying and coercion and shaming become normalized, and anyone who goes against it is punished, that's the sin of Sodom. Abraham's great niece is Lot's daughter, Pelotit. The Midrash tells us that she too heard about this policy of starving needy people. She thought it was wrong. She saw a poor man languishing in the town square for lack of food, and she felt sorry for him. And the next time she went to the well to get water, she brought a little bread in her pitcher and sneaked it to him. And after some time, she kept doing this, but the townspeople started to wonder, hey, why doesn't that guy in the town square die? How does he stay alive? And when they determined the reason, they took Pelotit out and burned her alive. And as she was being taken out to be burned, she prayed, she cried out, God of the universe, exact justice on my behalf from the Sodomites. And the Talmud writes that her cry, tza'akata, that is the tza'aka that we read about at the very beginning when God says, the cry of the Sodomites is so great, I need to go down and see whether this outcry, what it is. I have to see it for myself. God thinks when God says that, according to the Midrash, if the people of Sodom have done what this woman cries, I will turn the city's foundations from top to bottom and bottom to top. So here we are. Here we are. And since 2016, but really, with the rise of social media over the past 2 decades, public shaming and bullying and cruelty and humiliation have become a mainstream acceptable way of flexing dominance and power in the public sphere. And that is true here in the States. That is true in Israel. It's true in many countries around the world now. It's a scary time. That way of speaking and wielding authority just won an election in this country. And we are careening toward entering a time when policy, too, will be codified according to Midat Sdom, radical individuality to the point of cruelty that privileges insiders, that privileges people who already have wealth and does not share it. This used to be fringe in our society, this kind of cruelty and humiliation as a way of interacting socially. It would never have been acceptable for a leader to behave that way in the public square, let alone a president. But this has gone from the fringe to the norm. And our tradition emphatically, pleadingly, desperately asks us to see it, first of all, to recognize it for what it is, and to know how dangerous it is. It's not just words. It's words that leads to violence and leads to people getting hurt. And not to get sucked in, not just because individuals get hurt, though they do, but rather because this is what will lead to our collective destruction. And I know that sounds dramatic, but this time it won't be by God's hand, rather by our own, and by a kind of day-by-day dissolving of the social bonds that hold us in life and in love and in happiness and in community and in allyship with other groups and in trust in a justice system that holds people accountable and in government that functions to serve people, all people, and that nobody is above. When the bonds of trust that hold a society together corrode and break under the weight of a mindset of scarcity and suspicion of the other and individualism and cruelty and callousness, my friends, if we go down this road, there will be nothing left to save. If you take the vertical God out of the story and simply observe that something awful was going on in Sodom and Gomorrah and those cities were destroyed, perhaps this is what that looked like. A slow and eventual corrosion and destruction from the inside. So, what do we do? Well, one is let us not normalize any of this. Let us not say to ourselves, it is what it is. I'll just keep my head down and in 4 years I'll vote for a different government. It's easy to put responsibility of changing course onto the heads of those who have the most power. Sure, it's harder to make change where we can, or it may feel that way, but we need to work harder. We need to work harder. This pushing against the current means that as we walk down the street, we need to work harder to remember to catch the eyes of the person sitting outside the grocery store, to affirm their humanity and to help in some concrete way. We may need to work harder as we continue to engage on the subject of Israel and Palestine and care about the welfare of Gazans and West Bank Palestinians and Israelis, Jews and Arabs and everyone else, and not see anyone in this equation as strangers and outsiders who threaten our family, but as part of one family that lives in a place that needs our love and support, not one at the expense of the other, because all need to thrive there ultimately in order for anyone to thrive. We will need to figure out how to be like Avraham and Pilotit, which, let's be honest, Abraham did not get what he fought for. He fought hard and he did not get what he envisioned. And Pilotit did. She got justice, the justice she prayed for, but she paid the ultimate price for her principles. So let us also figure out how to resist the systems and push back against the systems that hurt people and protest, but do it in a way that affirms and preserves our humanity and safety too. And the humanity and safety of the people we are marching and protesting and resisting and organizing with. The lesson of Sodom is that when cruelty and bullying and barbarism and violence and hurting people become norms in society, if we countenance it and resign ourselves to it because it's too hard to look at it, or too hard to do anything about, then we don't need God to send down fire and brimstone. That society has already corroded and begun its own process of self-destruction. We can do better. We can be better. We can swim against the current. We have to. We have to swim and act against the examples being set from on high and set better examples for one another. Starting right here, in this spiritual community, right here, you, me, everybody watching, everybody listening, lest we forget that we are children of Abraham, of the original radical hospitality provider and justice advocate. So for the sake of humanity, ours and everyone else's, let us be ready for this.